While many saw the Revolutionary War as being fought to free the 13 colonies from the chains of debt, and not just from the foreign control of the private interests in England, Alexander Hamilton had a different idea in mind. In December 1790, he submitted a report to Congress by which he was proposing the creation of the Bank of America, modeled after the Bank of England, of course. Thomas Jefferson, for example, was opposed to the idea, as he saw such an institution as monopolistic, likely undermining the position of the state banks, eroding their independence, and favoring the same merchants and private interests that plagued England, as opposed to the American farmers and plantation owners that tended to be debtors. He argued that the Constitution did not give authority to the government to establish corporations, and especially not privately owned ones. Despite much opposition, after 2 months of debate, the bill was signed into law in February 1791, leading to the creation of the first Bank of the United States, which opened at the end of the year in Philadelphia with a 20-year charter. Branches continued to be opened in most major cities, such as Boston, New York, Charleston, etc., numbering 8 in total. The bank was initially worth $10 million, split into shares, with 20% being owned by the government, while the rest, surprise surprise, owned just as it was in England. For some context, $1 was tied to the value of silver, being worth 24 grams of silver, and there was a fixed conversion rate of 1 to 15 gold to silver. Thus, $1 was equivalent to 1.6 grams of gold. In other words, an ounce of gold was worth just under $18. For simplicity's sake, we will calculate the total initial cost to acquire the bank in grams of gold, which we will convert to $25. The total valuation of the bank was 16 million grams of gold worth in dollars, with 3.2 million being owned by the United States government, while 12.8 million was acquired by private investors. At current spot prices, 1 gram of gold being worth $110, that leaves us with a total valuation of $1.76 billion 2025, with just above $1.4 billion being spent by investors to acquire 80% of the Central Bank of the United States, which went on sale in July 1791, being sold so quickly that many would-be investors lost out on a truly once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. That being said, things were not all bad. In 1792, the Coinage Act was passed, establishing the US Mint in Philadelphia, then the capital of the nation, officially tying the value of the dollar to the aforementioned rate of silver and gold. Citizens were allowed by law to bring their silver or gold bullion to the mint to be coined free of charge, while the punishment for debasement was very severe, being the death penalty, and based on what we have learned in the previous video, I would argue was very much justified. While the bank was largely privately owned, the US government had more of a say here than the English government had in England over its own bank. The Bank of America acted as the fiscal agent of the federal government, handling most economic matters such as tax collection, paying the government's bills, transferring money, and so on. In order to avoid inflation, the bank was forbidden from buying US government bonds. The bank also operated in the private sector, where it could loan out money to private individuals, with its banknotes entering circulation through the loan process and being the only banknotes accepted by the federal government for the paying of taxes. But of course, not the only banknotes in circulation, as private banks were still able to print their own independently. The central bank was significantly less powerful than its modern counterparts, as it did not set monetary policy or hold large reserves, but it was still prominent, being one of the largest corporations in America. It was still able to alter the monetary supply within the broader economy, changing the levels of interest charged. But the dollar was always backed by large amounts of gold that allowed for financial stability. The central bank would exchange its gold for the banknotes of private banks, giving them more gold, which they could use as collateral to print more banknotes, expanding the monetary supply, leading to increased loaning and thus investments in the economy, which led to growth. And when too much loaning was undertaken, the central bank would exchange the private banknotes it held for gold, lowering the amount of available gold that the private banks had, forcing them to scale back on the loaning as having lesser collateral. The bank's branches were all located in bustling port cities, which facilitated easy tax collection, as the majority of the government's revenue came from tariffs on trade, as there were no federal taxes on American citizens. In fact, on the federal level, the only ones that paid taxes were the merchants that would bring foreign goods into the United States, while locally produced goods were not taxed, with one small exception, on distilled spirits, that quickly led to a revolt, the so-called Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 Pennsylvania. There were some limited state taxes, but generally not very burdensome, with the main form of taxation being levied on property owners, being around 0.5 to 1% per year, with the properties being often undervalued. There was also, in some states, a poll tax, a fixed amount of 50 cents to $1 per year, only for adult male citizens that was required for voting. There were some isolated cases of taxes on sin, such as alcohol, taverns, luxury goods, and so on, but they were low and often unenforced. For professionals, there were also some small licensing fees for opening up a business, but that was about it. For some more context, a middle class landowner in an established state like Massachusetts or Virginia might pay $2 to $5 a year in property tax, 0.5 to $1 on poll tax, and perhaps another dollar on some other taxes, with a total of $3.5 to $7 a year. Such a middle class farmer could expect to make between $100 and $300 a year by himself, on top of having all basic expenses covered, as he would produce most of his family's food, making his own tools, with his wife making clothing for the family, and of course not having any mortgage or rent to pay. The land could be inherited or bought for a moderate price in more established areas and very cheaply on the frontier, with many just settling unclaimed land, which was abundant and not paying a dime. Even a relatively poor farmer could expect to make $100 a year and only pay a couple percent in state tax and no federal tax at all. For some context, that $100 would be worth about $17,600 today, so about $17,000 after tax. Land on the frontier could be expected to cost around $1.2 per acre, 4,000 square meters. Hiring a laborer for a day costed 0.5 to $1, while a wool coat could cost anywhere from $5 to $10. But again, the farmer had the vast majority of his basic expenses covered, and because of the lack of taxes, products were much cheaper then compared to today. Imagine buying an acre of land for under $200 nowadays. But let's go back to the business of the bank. By 1808, discussions about renewing the bank's charter began, 3 whole years before its expiration. And let's not forget that the bank was not guaranteed its existence for more than 20 years. The shareholders of the bank asked Congress to extend the charter the following year. The Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, recommended the same. Neither Congress nor the House of Representatives took any action. By January 1811, the matter could not be postponed any further, and as such, a debate was held in both chambers of Congress. Later that month, a vote was held in the House of Representatives, where 71 voted for the extension of the bank charter. 72, however, voted against, while the Senate vote initially resulted in a tie. But then George Clinton, the Vice President of the United States, cast the tie-breaking vote against the renewal of the bank charter. On March 4th, finally, the privately owned central bank closes, but the private bankers did not like this, not one bit. A very powerful British financier did not like this in particular, as he had controlling stock in the American bank, and as a result of the bank's closing, he had lost millions. After this fact, significant pressure was put on the British Parliament to go to war to retake the colonies. On May 11, 1812, the British Prime Minister and devout Christian Spencer Perceval, who was vehemently against what would later come to be known as the War of 1812, was assassinated. 1 month later, on June 18th, the British declared war on the United States, a war that would officially last until February 1815. By the end of that year, on the 5th of December more precisely, President Madison proposed the creation of a second Bank of the United States. 13 months later, on January 7, 1816, the United States Congress finally created the second Bank of the United States. Its capitalization was 3.5 times higher than before, at 35 million, or nearly 6.2 billion in today's dollars, and the split remained the same, with 20% being owned by the government, while 80% was mostly in the hands of the same old bankers. It had 29 branches instead of the original 8, and it now had the power to regulate all banks in the nation, and could exercise more control over their assets than ever before. To add to that, in 1819, the case McCulloch v. Maryland was heard in the Supreme Court. As the state of Maryland attempted to tax the Baltimore branch of the Bank of the United States, one of the bank's cashiers, James McCulloch, refused to pay the tax. The Supreme Court was asked to decide two things. Firstly, does Congress have the constitutional authority to create a national bank? And secondly, can a state tax that federal bank? Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of the bank, claiming that even though the Constitution does not explicitly say Congress can create a bank, based on the necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8, he said that, quote, "Let the end be legitimate. All means which are appropriate are constitutional." As a result of this ruling, federal power was greatly extended, as the Congress now had implied powers, far beyond those specifically listed in the Constitution. On the second point, the justice claimed that, quote, "The power to tax involves the power to destroy." And as such, if the states could tax federal institutions, they could destroy them, which would mean that federal law would be subordinated to state law, which would violate the supremacy clause in the Constitution. In other words, the federal government was assured significantly more power, and the primarily privately owned central bank was legitimized to do more or less as it pleased. But not all was lost. In 1828, an absolute Chad comes to the scene, the newly elected 7th President of the United States and war hero Andrew Jackson. Immediately after defeating his pro-bank opponent, John Quincy Adams, he began an investigation of the Second Bank of the United States, shortly concluding that the bank was privately owned, primarily by stockholders from foreign nations, coincidentally the same ones that had gripped Europe's banks also, with these shareholders exercising great influence over the economic and by extent political landscape of America. Andrew Jackson is quoted as saying, addressing the most prominent financiers, quote, "You are a den of thieves, vipers, and I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out." In 1832, the bankers tried to get a renewal bill for the bank passed, but Andrew Jackson single-handedly stopped it by using his veto power. He then made a speech in which he claimed, quote, "More than 8 million of the stock of the bank is held by foreigners who are more dangerous than the military power of an enemy." The same year, Andrew Jackson was up for re-election, but the foreign bankers were not having it, so they sponsored his adversary's campaign with $3 million, an enormous sum at the time, but they still could not defeat the Chad, who got 54.2% of the votes, compared to Henry Clay, who despite the massive foreign support only got 37.4%. I will now take the time to also highlight the situation of the national debt. In 1815, at the end of the War of 1812, the national debt stood at $127 million, or $22,220,025, which back then was seen as something that had to be paid, and as such, over the next 14 years, by 1829, when Jackson became president, it was down to $58.4 million, or just over $10,020,025. This debt represented less than 10% of the United States GDP. Today, the national debt is 120% of GDP. For some further context, the British national debt at the time was £800 million, at 7.3 grams of gold per pound. At the current price of $110 per gram of gold, 1 pound was worth roughly $825, and as such, the total debt of Britain in 1829 was $640 billion 2025 dollars, equivalent to 200% of GDP, and 64 times more debt than the United States had. As he became president in 1829, Andrew Jackson made a real priority of paying off the remaining debt, and in the beginning of January 1835, after 5 years in office, he made the last payment, clearing the US national debt for the first and only time in US history. Later that month, an assassin by the name of Richard Lawrence tried to kill the president but failed. At this, Andrew Jackson famously said, quote, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." 2 years before, he had ordered that federal deposits be removed from the national bank and put into state banks, which was done by the end of 1833. As a result, the national bank greatly shrank in both size and influence. Then, the governor of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, attempted to force the hand of the president by calling in loans to replace the money taken out by the federal government, hoping for a popular backlash against the administration and to force the redepositing of federal funds into the central bank. To this, Andrew Jackson said, quote, "When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin." The governor's plan backfired, however, proving to the public that the bank was created to serve the big moneyed interests rather than the nation and its people. As a result of all this, in April 1834, the House of Representatives voted against rechartering the bank and confirmed that federal deposits should remain in state banks. This was finally the well-warranted end of the Second Bank of the United States, and there will be no such institution in America throughout its arguably best years, not until much later at least. On his deathbed, Andrew Jackson was asked what his greatest accomplishment was, and without having to think long, he exclaimed, "I killed the bank."